Germany had a hugely successful range of assault guns, tank destroyers, and tank hunters, which were developed during the Second World War. It was clear from the early days of World War II that the Wehrmacht's anti-tank units would need to be motorized, as existing horse or automobile-drawn units were too slow to be effective. Following the Battle of France, the Germans recognized the need for a mobile vehicle, carrying a larger gun to protect tanks from armor attacks, while providing infantry support. As the war progressed, the German army faced an ever-increasing amount of enemy armor, while its own tank forces were steadily being reduced. Due to losses and limited production capabilities, the Germans were forced to introduce a series of improvised anti-tank vehicles. The Panzerjäger were initially formed as a stopgap, using a variety of German or captured Czech and French light tank chassis, armed with Czech, French, and Russian guns. German self-propelled guns served a variety of purposes, with the primary goal of providing a platform for anti-tank guns or field artillery. It is important to note that German self-propelled guns had both open-topped and enclosed fighting compartments, mounted on a wide range of tank chassis. These were known as Panzerjäger, or Sturmgeschütz, and they used light and medium tank chassis. The Germans also used the term Jagdpanzer to describe more heavily armored versions of the Panzerjäger, which were built on medium and heavy tank chassis. The most notable were the Marder series of Czech-built vehicles, as well as purpose-built heavy tank destroyers such as the Nashorn, based on the Panzer IV, and the Jagdpanther, based on the Panther tank. The fact that the majority of the lighter Panzerjäger armored vehicles had open tops, and later included enclosed heavier hunting tanks like the Jagdpanzer, Jagdpanther, and Jagdtiger is equally puzzling to the uninitiated. The Germans converted captured French and Czech light tanks into gun carriers by removing the turrets and installing various guns behind light armor shields that protected the crews. They were stop-gap measures until something more appropriate could be designed and produced. On the other hand, their survivability was quite limited due to their limited armored protection. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the brains behind the German invasion of the West in 1940, on the other hand, argued for the introduction of a highly mobile, well-protected, and well-armed self-propelled artillery gun. These were known as Sturmgeschütz, or simply Stugs, and were introduced into service alongside the first anti-tank vehicles during the May 1940 attack on the West. These were dedicated designs that were fully protected and strongly armed. These vehicles were designed to provide infantry with mobile close fire support during combat operations. In late 1941, out of desperation, the Germans began refitting these vehicles with long guns to create new anti-tank vehicles. The Germans unintentionally created a highly effective tank destroyer by combining their low silhouette, good frontal protection, and powerful gun. Despite not being designed for that specific role, the Stug performed admirably in the anti-tank role due to its improved weaponry. The Stug would go on to be built in great numbers and used up to the end of the war. Their 75mm L-24 short-barrel gun was eventually replaced by a 75mm L-43, and later by the more powerful L-48 gun. These proved to be more than capable of destroying most enemy targets at ranges greater than 1 kilometer. Its low profile due to the lack of a turret made it an excellent ambush tank, and the fact that it was less expensive to build than a regular tank made it incredibly cost-effective. Germany produced more Sturmgeschütz anti-tank guns than Panzer IV tanks. More than 11,000 of these mobile guns were produced. The advantage of the turretless design was that they took less time to produce and then get them to the battlefield. The disadvantage was that to aim, the tank needed to be steered to the left or right. That meant the engine had to be running, which could reveal an ambush position. So, while extremely effective, the Stug was a defensive armored vehicle used for support and ambush. The war turned into a numbers game as it progressed. Germany required more armored fighting vehicles that were both cheaper and faster to build. They began mounting anti-tank guns and artillery howitzers on the hulls of captured tanks and reliable but obsolete tanks like the Panzer 38T. The Jagdpanzer 38 tank hunter was designed with a low profile, making it difficult to target and easy to conceal. It was only 2.1 meters in height, making it ideal for ambush tactics. It was armed with a powerful 75mm POC 39L48 gun, capable of knocking out most enemy tanks. It was cheaper and faster to construct than a Panzer IV, Panther, or Tiger tank. However, it was not intended to be a close combat vehicle, used at the front of an attack like a tank. It was a self-propelled anti-tank gun designed to be deployed on flanks to prevent counterattacks. A group of Jagdpanzer 38 tank hunters would hide in a wood or thick hedgerow, and pick off enemy tanks at long range. The sloping front armor provided adequate protection from frontal attack. The crew could expect to survive a hit from an enemy armor-piercing shell, as long as the driver pointed the front of the vehicle at any threat. Because of the vehicle's thin armor on the sides and rear, it was vulnerable to flank and rear attacks with armor-piercing shells. If the driver was in danger of being outflanked, he had to change locations quickly. Lacking turrets, the German assault guns, tank destroyers, and tank hunters were primarily designed to support the infantry and panzergrenadier divisions, making them a distinct fighting arm from the Panzerwaffe. Because the assault guns were used to equip the assault artillery batteries, they were under the direct command of the German army's artillery, rather than the Panzerwaffe, resulting in an unnecessary turf war. As the war progressed, these armored vehicles were assigned to independent Stug brigades, assault gun detachments, Panzerjäger detachments, and tank detachments of infantry and panzer divisions. Due to a lack of tanks, they were frequently called upon to fill the role of panzers. General Heinz Gudarian, a key architect of Hitler's panzer forces in the 1930s, was opposed to the assault gun concept. He recognized it for what it was, an infantry support weapon designed for defense, rather than offense. He reasoned that the Stug and Jagdpanzer lacked the flexibility of a panzer, capable of firing in all directions. Gudarian was furious that the Panzer IV medium tank, which had served as the backbone of the Panzerwaffe throughout the war, had been dissipated by Stug 4 and Jagdpanzer 4 production. Although the assault gun's primary role evolved from assault artillery to anti-tank weapon, these units were still under the command of the artillery. As a result, the Stug crews were gunners rather than Panzertruppen. The Stug 3, Stug 4, and Stug 42 fully enclosed assault guns served as the backbone of such units. In contrast, the Panzer Arm manned the Panzerjäger and Jagdpanzer, which were dedicated tank killers. Although assault gun units, Occasionally served in Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions, they were usually controlled at the corps or army level, and were assigned on a temporary basis to units that needed their firepower. Assault guns were also used as dedicated units within infantry, Panzergrenadier, and Panzer divisions in the second half of the war. At the very start of the Second World War, the assault artillery was intended to provide close fire support for the advancing infantry by blasting enemy bunkers and weapons positions. Once the tide of the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, tank hunters began to play an increasingly important role in strengthening the panzers in tank-on-tank battles. By 1942, self-propelled guns were becoming increasingly useful in stopping enemy tanks. This was due, in part, to the removal of the restricted space of a tank turret, which allowed the large fixed superstructure to accommodate larger caliber and longer range guns. Once the Wehrmacht was forced to fight a largely defensive war on both the eastern and western fronts, the lack of all-round gun traverse was no longer a major issue. When an assault gun was dug in, it presented a smaller target than its counterparts, transforming it into a lethal defensive weapon. In reality, German assault and self-propelled guns actually eclipsed the Panzers. They were cheaper and faster to build, and by the end of the war, they had frequently supplanted tanks within Panzer battalions. Indeed, the numerous Stug and Panzerjäger variants reflected Germany's inability to come up with a single utilitarian design and stick with it. The Stug and Jagdpanzer also demonstrated that by the end of the war, German armored doctrine had completed a full circle, from offense to defense. Gudarian and his colleagues may have argued that attack was the best form of defense, but this was not what Hitler's assault guns and tank destroyers were designed for. They remained an independent defensive weapon. Regardless of Heinz Gudarian's reservations about the development of the Sturmgeschütz and Panzerjäger, they played a major role in the armored battles fought by the Wehrmacht. By the end of the war, the number of surviving Stugs demonstrated that they had borne the brunt of the fighting just as much as Gudarian's panzers. The Sturmartillerie crews considered themselves the elite of the artillery, and claimed to have destroyed 20,000 enemy tanks by 1944. They were ideal for the massive defensive battles fought on the Eastern Front, as well as in Italy and Normandy, and ultimately they were instrumental in delaying the defeat of Hitler's Nazi Germany. Thanks again to Masterworks for sponsoring this video. Get priority access using the link in the description.